Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Retronaut. What we are looking at today is the third episode in a series where I look at computer and video games. I'm saying it's the third episode, but in fact, it's kind of like the fourth chapter. Let me explain. The first episode, we looked at the first edition. In the second episode, we looked at the second and third edition, so it was a bit of a double bubble. Quite long one, that one. I think it was about an hour long. So in this chapter, we're just going to look at one edition of the magazine, and that's going to be the February edition of 1982. Now, the reason why I started looking at these magazines with you is because I found a bunch of my magazines in my mother's loft. And these are my original magazines from back in the 1980s. And I was leafing through, in particular, Zap magazines, which I was a big fan of back in the day, being a Commodore 64 person. And they were fantastic magazines, but when I was leafing through them, I realized that in fact they came along quite a lot later than I remember the first magazines that I was reading back in the day. I actually had a Dragon 32 in 1982, as far as I recall, and at the time one of the big magazines was Computer and Video Games. I've got an edition of it here from 1987. Now, this magazine that you see here is radically different from the magazine that was launched in late 1981. You've got to understand that it was the very early days of microcomputing in the UK, not so much overseas in the US. Over there, things have been rolling along for about 3 years. But over here, it was still very nascent. Computers were much more expensive for us over here in the UK, because generally we were importing them from either the US or Japan. But there was a microcomputing community. And in 82, I became one of that community when I bought my Dragon 32. Previous to that, I actually owned an Atari console, the 2600, and I was a child of about 10 years old when I got my Atari console, and I was very happy with that. But something that I really had an aspiration to do was to actually do some programming. I knew that you could do basic programming on these computers, and obviously with a console, you couldn't do that. It didn't have a keyboard, and it just wasn't part of the whole concept of having a console. A console was just for playing games, right? So I really wanted to get a computer, and that meant I became interested in computing magazines. And the first one that I was aware of was Computer and Video Games. It was initially launched to create a fun computer magazine, because up until that point, they tended to be pretty staid. You know, they were about business, and that was fine. You know, obviously that was a big part of computing then and now. But if you were into video gaming and doing coding, learning how to code, then you needed a different kind of magazine. And this is where Computer and Video Games stepped into the picture and delivered, really. It was a bit of a revelation because, as I said, up until that point, magazines were very staid and serious, you know, to match the sort of topic that people thought the computers were only really for doing business on. Anyway, let's move on. Let's have a look at this edition. We'll follow the same format as the other chapters so far, where we look at the cover and then various sections of the magazine. In each edition, I'm going to try and pick out things that I find interesting. By all means, try and get hold of these magazines yourself and have a read through them, because there are many things in there, and obviously things which may be interesting to you won't necessarily be that interesting to me. But I've picked out a few things that make up a reasonable amount of content for you to enjoy today. Anyway, let's move on and take a look at the cover art. But before we do that, let's have a quick word from our sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay, where you can make your tech dreams a reality. And now in PCBWay's new Project Share, you can upload your projects and share them with the community. And if you do use any of these projects, a percentage of the money that you pay will actually go to the author. So you can share your projects, and you can also benefit the projects that others have shared on PCBWay. So if you do have any projects, why not upload them to PCBWay and get them out to the community? And of course, why don't you browse the Project Share and see if there's something there that's interesting for you? Because whether it's PCB prototyping, PCB assembly, 3D printing, or even CNC machining, PCBWay is the way. Starting with an instant quote for your PCB projects, PCBWay will leap into action, building your PCB, assembling it for you if you wish, and once it's passed their quality tests, it'll be winging its way to you in a flash. PCBWay, PCB prototyping the easy way. So it's February of 1982, and at this point, Christmas has just passed. The mince pies have just been put away. You're probably recovering from the bloating of eating so much food over the festive period. So if you're reading computer and video games, you've probably just bought a computer, or possibly already have a computer, obviously. If you just bought one, you may be having buyer's remorse, wondering if you've bought the right machine. Because at the time, it was, to be honest, it was bewildering. You just really didn't know which machine you should put your money on. And that's something that we're going to hit on in this episode. We're going to have a look at a letter where somebody's asking for some help about what machine they should buy. And what can we see on the cover of this issue? Well, the magazine still says it's fun, because it's worth reiterating. Magazines at this time were mainly very serious. Computers were seriously expensive pieces of machinery to do serious work, accounting, databases, things like that. All of a sudden, there were a number of people out there who wanted to use their computers for video gaming. The console revolution had happened in the US with the Atari 2600, and people didn't just see their computers now as just, work machines. They saw them as being fun things like a console where they could play games as well. So that's why this magazine makes a point of actually, saying that it's actually fun, not just a serious magazine for doing serious work. So what can we see on the cover? Cosmos landing, I'm assuming that's some kind of, I don't know. There was a game many years later called Thrust where you had to land vertically on a planet. I'm not sure if this is a game which they're going to review in this edition. We'll look out for it. Alternatively, it could actually be a type-in program because this magazine was very big on type-ins. Dr. Livingstone, I think that's a type-in game. Then they say that they have games and programs for the Sinclair. By the Sinclair, they mean the ZX80 and the ZX81 at this point. I don't think the Spectrum had quite been launched. At least it wasn't mainstream at this point. Then you've got the PET, Commodore PET, which is a model of computer rather than being a brand. So it's odd that they say the Sinclair, but then they don't say the Commodore. Anyway, you've got the Apple. Again, it's a little bit nebulous what they're saying there. It's actually the Apple II, I'm pretty much sure they're talking about, because the Apple III had come out by this point and it hadn't been a success. It also incredibly expensive, so probably about 3 people had it in the UK, if that at all, really. Then you've got the Tandy, which would be the TRS-80, I guess the color computer as well. And of course it says many more, because there were just many, many more computers at this time. Dark Tower, the latest fantasy concept in electronic games. I'm not sure what they're talking about there. Again, we'll keep an eye out for it and see if it turns up. And then at the bottom, in the spirit of this magazine, which is all about not just fun and playing video games, but also making your own software. This magazine, at least in the early days, was a big advocate of you actually trying to write your own software. And there are many tutorials showing you how to write programs in pretty much BASIC. I think there is some assembly as well, but mainly it's BASIC, because that's what the vast majority of its customers would have had access to. Anyway, a nice, colourful piece of artwork. Again, not every cover of CMVG at this point is fantastic in my opinion, but I think this one's actually a bit of a stunner. Yeah, it's a great piece of artwork, and I'm sure it would have inspired people to buy this edition of the magazine. So another issue and another advert, this one from Computer Supermarket. And it's actually pretty professional looking, I think. And I've included it in this video just to give you another snapshot of what people were actually buying at the time here in the UK. Top left, you got the VIC-20. Obviously, this would have been a budget option in this lineup here at £189. The VIC was a capable machine, but unfortunately was kind of hamstrung to some degree by its graphics chip. The text display, for instance, was very crude. And I think it was something that really held the machine back, which is a pity. Obviously, Commodore made some notes about this and then came out with the C64. They addressed those issues and, well, we know how that went. The C64 was a massive success, wasn't it? Next to it, we got the TI-99-4. This was a machine I lusted after, actually, and I think it was partially to do with the way it looked. It was just a great-looking machine with its silver case that you can see there in front of the TV. And of course, it had purportedly 16-bit technology. The problem was that, as far as I remember it, the CPU was actually 16-bit, but it didn't have a 16-bit bus, which meant it actually ran at the same speed as an 8-bit machine. Although I would assume that internally it actually ran faster, so it must have had some extra horsepower from that 16-bit CPU. At least you would like to think it had. Any TI-99 owners out there, let us know. Then, of course, you've got 2 famous machines from the era, the Atari 400 and the 800. Now, the 400, of course, was a fantastic machine, basically the same machine as the 800 with some cut down hardware. It only has one cartridge slot in the top underneath that flap that you can see there. And the 800 obviously had two. It turned out in the end that the second cartridge in the 800 wasn't really that useful because it was only used, I think, for one cartridge. And so really what you're getting in the 800 is more memory expansion, and obviously the better keyboard. It's a great machine, the 800. Something I would like to get in my collection, but space is tight here, even with a cabin. But I do have an Atari 800 XL, but this is the machine that I used to lust after when I was a teenager, looking in the cabinet at Woolworths at their computer display. No price drop yet on the Atari. It's still holding the prices from a few months ago, so we'll have to keep an eye on that as the months roll by. So in the last couple of editions of this series, we have dipped into the mailbag a little bit, and I'd like to do so here again because I think it gives us an insight into actually what was happening on the ground at the time. And I did notice this letter here, BBC Games, and it says, "Dear Sir," one thing I noticed is that people are much more formal back in the 80s than they are now. That certainly you can see there's a loosening up of the language over time. "I am about to buy a BBC microcomputer." I'm assuming he means the BBC A microcomputer that was made for the government's computer literacy project here in the UK. And he goes on to say, "And I would be pleased if you could let me have sources of directly or readily adaptable available game software suitable for a 32K RAM machine. Colin Lindsay, Chorley in Lancashire." Well, if we carry on down the page, you'll see, sadly, the story isn't so great for him. The editor says, "At the moment, the only firm known to be producing game software for the BBC microcomputer is Acorn, the firm making the hardware. The latest word is that Acorn is in the process of converting some of the games currently on its BBC books to run on the BBC machine. But these are not expected to be readily available at least until March at the very earliest." Don't forget, it's February at this point, so I'm afraid you will just have to sit tight or get to grips with programming and work on some of your own games. Colin, good luck. So there you go. That's what it's like being an early adapter back in the 1980s. He's bought his BBC Micro, it's a fantastic machine, and he has absolutely no software for it whatsoever. What can you say about that? Well, I think when I bought my C64, I remember it actually had a pretty good manual, and it did come with some games, and there were games already available for it on cartridge. And I got in there pretty early with the C64, to be honest, probably just a few months, maybe 6 months after it came out. So maybe a smaller company like Acorn was struggling at this point to actually get a reasonable amount of software to go out there and showcase what this fantastic machine could do. Bit of a sad story, that one, but I thought it was interesting. So let's have a look at the next letter. So this next letter is titled Atari Fame, and the writer goes into a little bit of a complimentary section where he says how good the magazine is, and then he gets to the main subject, which is, "I am a keen computer games player and writer, although I only presently own a Sinclair ZX80. I am looking around to buy myself a new computer and have heard that the Atari Duo have by far the best graphics facilities. Although I've never seen either of these machines in action, could you please tell me if the Atari 400 and 800 graphics are more impressive than other machines in a similar price range? And if so, why aren't other manufacturers using a similar system?" Well, I must admit that's quite a difficult question to answer. I would say that definitely the Atari machine was in a different universe to the ZX80. The amount of memory on those machines, the amount of colors, the hardware, sprites, things like that, just put it in a different universe. But anyway, let's see what the editor of the magazine goes on to give as advice. "The Atari computers certainly have good graphics characters, and the games ROM packs, in other words the cartridges, that plug into the system use these to their best advantage. However, the highest resolution of the Atari system is 320 by 192 points, or picture elements, pixels. This is quite acceptable for most users. The Atari computers cost around £345 to £645, and that obviously is in way more money than a ZX80 cost. Other manufacturers do use high-resolution graphics in up to 16 colours. Notable amongst these is the Atari competitors The Die, with the PC-1 costing £595. This has more memory than the Atari 800, 48K, compared to 16K in the Atari 800, and has even more pixels, 335 by 255. Unfortunately, it has only a small amount of very good software." It sounds to me like the editor owns a Die, right? I mean, by the way they're talking about it. "Texas Instruments have recently reduced the price of the TI 994A to around £300. This has a similar specification to the Atari 800, and has the capability of superior graphics because of the use of 16-bit processor. As I said earlier, it may be 16-bit internally, but the bus is 8-bit, which basically slows the computer down massively. The 800 did have a lot of co-processors, which made it a very capable machine. As you can see, I've only scratched the surface, and more systems are coming onto the market all the time. That was certainly true. The VIC-20 and the BBC microcomputer will also give the Atari 400 a run for its money, and both are cheaper. You can see that it's more difficult than you at first thought. Get friendly with your local dealer and find out what support he'll give you. Compare dealers if you have a choice, and then look at software availability and cost. Only you can evaluate all these factors yourself. So sadly, the editor has had to basically throw the question back in the face of the questioner. And I must admit, I think I would too. It was just so complicated at this time, and he didn't exactly know what that particular person wanted. It sounds to me like they were very much fixated on graphics, but that can mean different things. Does he mean the number of colors, or is he talking about pixel resolution? And I think the editor's made a decent effort to try and answer that. But the reality is, it's the entire computer that actually gives you the experience, the co-processors that may take a lot of extra work off the CPU. Although he does tout the TI 994A's 16-bit CPU, as we said earlier, it's really a 16-bit CPU with an 8-bit bus, and that really slows it down. It can operate on data internally in 16 bits, but then all the data flowing around the system is at 8 bits at a time, and that really reduces its capabilities. And then on top of that, how much do the custom chips of the Atari machines bring to the table? You know what? If I had to give advice to the guy, I would have said, go for it. Get the Atari 800. It's a fantastic machine, and you won't have any regrets. And I think that's actually true. Maybe a few months later, you know, when the Commodore 64 comes out, yeah, you'd have regrets. But that's the way it was back then. You didn't have hindsight. You just had to stick your finger in the air and choose a machine and hope that you'd chosen well. And this letter, well, it kind of leapt out at me really because of its strange turn of phrase. The language in it is odd. You know, as I said, that letters at this time tend to be more formal, but it's not just formal, it's just strangely worded. So anyway, let me read it out to you. And, well, one thing I will say actually is that it is right. I mean, the point of the letter is bang on, but it's just strangely put. So it says, "Dear Sir, to my mind, people are attracted to arcade games subconsciously, for they often get out far more than they put into these computers. Take Atari's BattleZone. It caught my eye in a fish and chip shop because of the XY monitor with vector scans." I don't know what he means by an XY monitor, but anyway, I guess he means a vector monitor. I don't know. As I said, the language is a little bit strange. "And the prodigious amounts of maths the computer gets through in real time. In case you haven't met it, it's a fighting tank simulator in which you drive around a valley dodging missiles and rocks. Everything is portrayed in full perspective, aka 3D, right down to the missiles flying longer to distant targets. A kind man," this is a little bit odd here, "a kind man let me mend one." I don't know how that happened. I don't know if it's the same one in the fish and chip shop. But anyway, this is quite interesting. "There is a 6502 riding a 12K program." I don't know what he means by riding. Maybe that's a typo. Maybe he means running. "Plus 4 custom bit slice chips doing 16-bit trigonometry among the 150 other support devices. She certainly puts out more than you put in. And I guess the software came out of the back door from NASA, Boeing and Lockheed. Thought your readers might be interested. Jonathan Pope, Chesterton Road, Cambridge." Yeah, it is. I don't know, there's some weird phrases in there. Maybe this person was very technical and knew things that I didn't know, and maybe the language of computing has changed, but I don't know what a bit slice chip is. 16-bit trigonometry, I guess what he's saying there is that the chips are 16-bit, and if that's true, that's very interesting because it says there's a 6502 in the BattleZone machine, and that is an 8-bit chip as far as I know. But, you know, arcade machines at this time, they very often put together some really interesting hardware combinations where you would have multiple processors doing different parts of what the game required. They were leaps and bounds ahead of what you had at home. And that's why, if you take a game like BattleZone, for instance, it was just totally impossible to recreate that in the home. If you look at the graphics, it's based on, I think the first video game ever, Space War, was actually produced on a mini computer using a vector display. That vector display wasn't really suited to producing text, but it was fantastic for drawing straight lines at any angle that you wanted to do. And you could chain those together to produce what looked like little spaceships, etc., etc. And Atari have taken on that idea here and actually use it to render a full 3D scene. Now, in 1980, this must have looked like complete science fiction. Only a couple of years earlier, I think I was watching Star Wars, and there's some 3D in that, computer graphics, I should say. From what I understand, they're actually hand-drawn because they couldn't actually get a computer, or at least the production team on Star Wars couldn't get a computer to actually render the real graphics. So, you know, just a couple of years later, you're in an arcade and there's a game in full 3D vector graphics. You can just put in 10 pence and play that game. Absolutely amazing. So the language is a bit strange, but my God, he's right, because BattleZone was just absolutely amazing. Obviously, the same technology then I think went on to allow Atari to do the Star Wars games, which were even more amazing. I won't talk about that game right now, Star Wars, because I'm sure that'll turn up in an edition pretty soon. BattleZone was definitely a landmark in video gaming back in the 1980s and a bit of a superstar for me in the arcade. And now for a section that's a little bit of a favourite of mine, I'll be honest, because I love the arcade games from this era. Arcade action. And this month actually delivers some interesting stuff. A couple of classics that have gone down in the annals of arcade history. And I've also plucked out an interesting, lesser-known game, which I think is interesting by the fact that it's a kind of clone of a game that's very much recognizable. First up, we've got Scramble, and I'm not sure if this was the first game in this genre, but this is a sideways scroller. And it could be that Scramble was actually the first game to exploit that idea. Previously, you had vertical scrollers where, you know, Space Invaders will come at you directly from above. Obviously, then you have things like Galaga where they move around to make it more interesting, and Galaxians where they swirl around to make it more difficult. But now, for the first time, I think, we have a sideways scroller, and the aim in Scramble is to basically go into a landscape and bomb things on the surface. And you've got the ability to fire forwards, and you can also drop bombs as well. I remember I was obsessed by this game. Rather, not this game, but a clone of it. When I was on holiday in Spain when I was a child, yeah, the amount of 10 pences that went into that machine was obscene. It was a copy of this game. It's actually a pretty good copy. I can't remember the name of it now. It has been quite a while. But definitely this style of game, the sideways scroller, was a favorite of mine. And it later went on to spawn absolute classics like R-Type as well. And was also a bit of a favorite on 8-bit computers as well. So yeah, definitely Scramble is a game that I have a lot of fondness for. And I'm sure a lot of people do out there. So the second game is Galaga, and that was actually referred to in the previous issue of this video series. And it's basically a development of Galaxians. I think it's by the same company. We have different aliens here. They seem to be based on, I don't know, insects maybe, bees or something like that. It's always very hard to work out exactly what the monsters are. They look like butterflies though, butterflies and bees. Not sure I encountered this game that much in the arcade. I'm sure I saw it once or twice and had a game, and I think it's really cool the way it's developing on the ideas that you have in Galaxians, you know, where the creatures come down and swoop at you. And yeah, again, this went on to become something of a classic. I think Galaxians and Galaga are pretty well known in arcade lore. Next up, this appears to be a clone of Pac-Man, I would say. I mean, look, it's a maze, and you've got a character that moves around the maze, but they've decided to go with a mouse and cat chase theme here, and you seem to be a mouse that's running around a maze picking up cheese. What I don't understand is why the cats don't seem to kill you very often. It appears you're able to become immune, and it also appears that you're able to become a dog and then chase the cats, which is a similar kind of mechanism to what you have in Pac-Man when you pick up the power pills and you can actually eat the ghosts. What do I think about it? Well, in some ways it's more logical, I suppose. It's less abstract than Pac-Man in that you've got recognizable characters, you know, a mouse being chased by cats. It's a little bit unoriginal, obviously, but there are some interesting elements here. You've got, for instance, the doors of the maze that seem to change, which make it a bit more dynamic. The movement of the cats is a little bit rudimentary. The animation's pretty basic, but you know, this is the early days of arcade games, and very often this was the sort of level of production that they could reach with, you know, limited hardware. Not sure I ever actually saw this in an arcade. My exposure to arcades was pretty limited. I went to the arcades in Port Talbot, Porthcawl, Swansea once or twice, but I never really went to many other places than that. And, you know, like a lot of people, we didn't see every single game that ever came out. So it's quite interesting, actually, to be reminded about this by the magazine and to see that it actually existed. So yeah, maybe I will get out my Mister and have a go of this sometime and see what it's actually like. But it looks like a reasonably interesting game. I don't know, what do you think? Something that was a big feature in magazines in the early 80s in the UK, I'm pretty sure it would be the same in the USA as well and other countries, is listings were a big thing. And computer and video games definitely felt that it was its bread and butter, really, to bring those to its readers, at least in the early days. You can see that this listing here, Dogfight, is meant to simulate obviously a dogfight between two World War I biplanes, and it runs on an Apple II. Not really sure which version of BASIC it is. I know that the Apple II had two different types, but anyway. So yeah, what did it involve? Okay, well, you'd have to sit down and generally type this in yourself, or if you had a friend, they could read it out to you, which, I mean, that's what I used to do. But when I think about it, it's actually probably not a good thing to do because you've got two people in the process then, and then there's even more chance of you making a mistake. But this listing was, I think, 4 pages long. So you can imagine it actually takes a lot of typing in. And then, of course, when you actually run the program, inevitably there are typos. And if you're lucky, it'll run. And if you're unlucky, there'll be bugs in there, because you can imagine that not all of these were necessarily tested rigorously by magazines. So I wasn't such a big fan of it, but a lot of people did actually cut their teeth on typing in these listings and then learning BASIC from them. So, you know, they did actually add value to the magazine. And it's for this reason, actually, that some of these listings appear on the front cover as headline features. One of those is Dr. Livingstone. And this is a game where you are meant to go into, as it says, deepest, darkest Africa. I'm not quite sure what it means by that phrase. That was a sort of borderline sort of racist term that used to be bandied about back in the old days. And yeah, I mean, if you have a look at the illustration, it's pretty questionable, isn't it? I mean, when I saw this, I was a bit shocked. But, you know, this was, what, 40 years ago? So obviously attitudes to race were very different from what they are today. And you can understand why people had a pretty bad time of racism back in the 1980s, at least in the UK. Anyway, things have luckily moved on. Things are not perfect, but yeah, definitely an issue with this one, I think. This one runs on a Sharp MZ80K. This was one of the machines which you see appearing in this magazine over and over. And it's interesting because it's largely disappeared from people's imagination over the years. And, you know, this is a massive listing, this one actually. It goes on for, I think, 6, maybe 8 pages, something like that. So yeah, it'd be a huge amount of work to type this in. But yeah, again, another interesting program and a little bit of a sort of insight into how society has changed since then. Then we have Cosmos Landing, and this was on the cover of the magazine, if you remember earlier. I'm not quite sure. What does it say here? The Terran enemy is keeping your planet under constant observation. 10 drone ships have to be landed in secret on the planet's surface. So yeah, it's a landing game. I'm assuming it would play a little bit like Tetris, I suppose. You'd have some character moving down the screen slowly, dropping towards the surface, and I'm assuming you'd have to avoid obstacles. I'm not sure if you control your velocity or anything like that. But yeah, so there we are. There are 3 more listings. There are actually many more in this particular edition. There usually are. It's usually jam-packed full of them, actually. And as we saw in a previous issue, computer and video games do actually pay people to send in their listings, and if they get published, they get paid for it. So a little bit of a cottage industry there going on. So I thought this was interesting. We talked earlier in this video about how limited the ZX80 and 81 were. Why were they limited? You can get into hot water with some people if you say that. They'll be quite defensive about these machines because these were, for many people in the UK, the first computer that they ever owned. And it is a valid computer. It has a decent processor in it. But because of the very low cost of these machines, there were many things that were limited on them. And that's why I think I was a little bit disparaging of them in a previous edition. Now, they are real computers and probably more powerful than the computers that help with the moon landings, but they have terrible keyboards. You can't really argue with that. Everybody at the time hated the keyboards because they had no travel. They were basically a membrane keyboard where you have to press on a hard surface. So you get no feedback whether you've actually typed the character correctly. And they're a pretty disturbing experience if you actually want to type in any sort of software. So you can see here, this company has made a keyboard, the ZX keyboard, which works for the ZX80 and the ZX81. It'll work for both of them, £27. I'm not sure how much that would have been back in those days, probably like £100, something like that today, maybe 150. I'm just putting my finger in the air there, not checking that, but not super cheap, but definitely an expansion for your computer, which would have made typing in software, etc., much easier. I can't say how good this particular keyboard is. It looks pretty bare bones. There's no actual case for it. It just looks like a kind of keyboard with the ribbon cable going into the ZX80 or 81. But yeah, interesting that there were definitely products out there which would allow you to expand your machine to make it more capable. Next on the list is a graphics ROM. And this is one of those things where it sounds great on paper. It's a ROM that you put in your machine, and instead of you having a certain number of graphics characters, you now have many, many more. And that's wonderful, except that if you were to write any software that made use of that, and you were to give it to your friend, they wouldn't have that ROM, and that's just not going to work. So it would be okay, I guess, if you wanted to write software purely for yourself, get use out of those extra characters, whatever that might be for, maybe for doing graphics on screen, because don't forget, these machines had very little memory. And one way that you could get around that was by creating your user interface out of these special characters, so effectively text. So you'd have a screen of text, and these characters would be lines, diagonal lines, vertical lines, circles, things like that. Pretty much like the PETSCII stuff that you see on the Commodore PET and later computers. So that one, again, is $27.95, which seems to be the magic number for this company. And then below, you've got a RAM expansion, again, for the 80 and 81. And there's a kit version, which is cheaper. And then there's I have to assume, assembled version. So the assembled version is £42.95. Obviously, RAM expansions were pretty expensive back in those days. That's why Sinclair didn't put that memory in the first place, because it just completely bust the budget of the machine, the market that they were trying to aim at. And you can also get the kit version as well, which is £32.95. Obviously, with the kit, you'd have to assemble it yourself. So that one really is only for the sort of persons out there who had a soldering iron and all that kind of equipment that you would need to put something together. Then down the bottom, you've got a 2K and 4K RAM. And these basically sound like chips that do you plug into the board or do you have to solder them in? I'm not quite sure. But these would take your machine up from, for instance, 1K to 5K if you bought the 4K chip. It doesn't sound like a lot of memory, to be honest, but when you've got a machine with 1K and all of a sudden you can put in a chip and you've got 5 times as much of the memory in total, then that's pretty liberating. And obviously, if your budget could stretch to it, you could get the 16K RAM expansion above and really push it. Not really sure if those can work in tandem. Can you use the 4K and the 16K together? I would assume you could, but it doesn't actually say it in this advert, so I'm not really quite sure about that. And then down below, you've got some software that they're selling. I thought it was interesting to have a quick look there at how some people were taking their very, very limited systems and expanding them and turning them into more capable machines. And I thought we'd wrap up this chapter of the series by looking at Kit Corner. I'm not sure if this is a one-off, but it's basically giving you information, tips and tricks on how you should assemble your kits. If you're getting a logic board with a bunch of chips supplied, as we saw in the last section, you'd have to put those together yourself. That would resonate, of course, with many in the retro community today who are actually building their own computers from parts, where you have sort of completely new versions of Commodore Amiga 4000 logic boards, and people are then assembling those into fully working Amiga 4000s from scratch, which I think is a very interesting part of the retro scene right now. But back in the day, people were basically buying computers in kit form to save money. And, they were very expensive computers back then. For many, the only way they could really get into it was by buying them as a kit and then putting them together themselves. I've had a read through this article and it's actually pretty good. It does give some good tips on how to put things together, especially it's more relevant to today by thinking about bodge wires. If you have to do a bodge wire on a logic board, which very often you have to do when they've been damaged by battery acid, you will find that traces on the board have been eaten away, either in small areas or sometimes completely. And very often the best way to fix that is to do a bodge wire, which basically connects between one end of where that trace went from to the other end where it connected to. And he gives advice about what gauge of wire to use, how to solder those wires onto the board, and also about edge connectors and more. Anyway, if you want to and you're able, just pause the screen and have read through this article. I think it's quite interesting. And I actually picked up a couple of interesting tips there about how to do things. It's definitely a good idea, for instance, as he says, if you're going to do many wires, to start off with the shortest ones, which then are the easiest, and they basically go underneath everything else, and then you finish with the longest wires on top. So it's interesting that he's worked out a procedure like that. You've got to have sympathy for these people back in the day. Maybe you were one of them actually putting your machines together. But I guess One of the things that would have come with was an amazing sense of accomplishment when you actually put it together yourself, turned it on, and you had a working computer. And I think that's one of the reasons why people do that today. Yeah, it's definitely an area of the retro scene that's quite popular with some people. So there we go. I really hope you enjoyed that overview of the magazine. As I said at the beginning of this video, I had to go in and select some things that I thought was interesting. And I hope you found them interesting too. Obviously, you got pretty salty items, like, for instance, the launch of Scramble, which is, looking back, a landmark game, one of the first, or maybe even the first sideways scroller. Then also you've got Galaga, again, now looking back, something of a classic game. But then you have the quirkier items, for instance, in the letters page, where we have that guy writing in about BattleZone. And, as I said, he wasn't wrong. I mean, it's an amazing game, and certainly it was something which at the time I remember seeing, I think for the first time, in a holiday park in Wales. I remember I went with my aunt and uncle for a week in a holiday park, and they had a BattleZone in this very large building. I think it's where they used to do performances, the kind of thing, almost like a Butlins. And they had people on stage dancing and singing in the evening, things like that. But during the day, when things were a little bit quiet, I would pop in there and I would get on the the dual joysticks of a BattleZone, because it's meant to simulate a tank. And I found that absolutely amazing. It was just a fantastic game. And obviously that technology that Atari developed went on to then supply a series of games. I think there was Red Baron or something like that. Wasn't there, like a biplane game? There's Star Wars, which, I mean, today is just still one of my absolute classics. It's something I'd love to have in the cabin, a Star Wars arcade machine. But even with my cabin, it's still not enough space really to have something like that. What else did we see? We were looking at the listings. I tend to skip those when I do these reviews, because at the end of the day, we can't really indulge in looking at that software or, type it in and see what it's like. It was kind of torturous even then, really, to do that. And those games, because they're written in BASIC and they're not super long, they do tend to be relatively simple. But at the same time, it's interesting to see what they were adding to the computing landscape out there. Now, over time, this magazine will obviously change. In the next edition, I'm not sure if we're going to look at 1 month or possibly 2. We'll see. I'll have to look through the next edition and see how jam-packed it is with interesting things. I'm assuming that some months it'll be a little bit quiet. So yeah, maybe the next edition we might be doing 2 months together again. Anyway, we'll have to see how that goes. I hope you enjoyed this video. Obviously, if you're new to the channel and you enjoyed it, then please go and watch the other videos in this series, because they're equally as good as this one, and I think you'll find those quite good fun. In fact, definitely do it, because it's nice to get the continuum of what was going on with this magazine as it developed from month to month. And if you did come for the first time and you've not been to the channel before, then please make sure that you like the video. Please click on the like button, because if you don't do that, the video will not go out to other people. I quite often see literally hundreds of people who watch my videos, or sometimes thousands of people, and I will only get a relatively small number of likes. Don't think that's necessarily because you're not enjoying the video. I'm hoping that you are, because I don't receive many negative comments, to be honest. In fact, very, very few. So I think it's just very easy to watch a video and go, great, thank you very much, and move on to the next one. But if you don't like the video, I won't get promoted, and it will languish. And, views and likes are the lifeblood of any YouTube channel. So please take a little bit of time and just click on the like button. Anyway, that by the side, if you did enjoy this video, then please click on subscribe if you're not a member of the channel. And then hopefully, if you also click on the notify button, the bell, you'll get notified when we release new videos in this series, and you can come back and enjoy them. Also, it'd be fantastic if you could join the channel. If you look at the bottom of the screen down there, you should see a join button on a computer. If you join the channel, it's a kind of subscription system, and then that money will go directly to me to help me to pay for equipment such as the camera that you're watching this on, various computers, the equipment that I use to repair things, etc., that you'll see in other videos. I also recently had somebody give me some money over Ko-fi, or is it coffee? I'm not sure how to say it. But basically, that was very much appreciated. And you can do that as well. The difference is instead of actually giving me money on a monthly basis, it's a one-off. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to give a one-off to me, a one-off high five, you can give me money on Ko-fi, and you can also do a super thanks on the video. So there are a number of ways of supporting the channel. So please, if you can, help out with things, because believe me, it's not cheap to make this content. Anyway, hope you enjoyed yourself, and hopefully we'll have another edition in this series soon. But until then, take care.